Well, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar about Church360 Ledger and helping a volunteer take on your church's finances. This will be an overview of Church360 Ledger, but more importantly, it's going to walk through some of the key things that a volunteer who is stepping into that role of treasurer or financial manager, whatever you call it, has a good understanding of how your church's finances work. So we're going to go through some of the basics of those finances, show how to manage those in Church360 Ledger, and answer your questions along the way. My name is Peter Frank. I am the Senior Manager of Concordia Technology Solutions. I've been with our group here in CTS for about 6.5 years or so. It's been a fantastic experience working with the team, learning how to use church software, and honestly, 6 years ago was something I had very little experience with. Well, since that time, being part of the team has been a huge help, but also as I've gotten more involved at my own church. I had always been involved in things like mission trips and Bible studies, but now I'm much more on the administrative side of things. So I'm the vice president of our church council, and I'm very active in our budgeting process and approving expenses. So it's given me a much better understanding of what is required from both a software level, but also people management. And that's where this idea for today came from. So I'm excited to share this with you. I don't have all the answers, but I do have some of them, and that's what I'm here to share with you today. My contact information is on the screen. Email is always the best way to get a hold of me. Although my phone number is there, it'll take you right to my office, which is right now forwarding to voicemail, so don't try calling. I have actually had people do that before. All right, so my housekeeping items for today before we get too far. I am planning about 50 minutes for a presentation, and we've got quite a bit to cover. So I may talk fast, and if I'm talking too fast, just put a note in the chat and tell me to slow down. But I do want to get it all covered in the time allotted. I'm saving about 10 minutes at the end for question and answers, which is probably a little bit more generous. Typically, our Q&A time takes about 5 or 6 minutes, so I may go over that 50 minutes if I don't have many questions waiting for me. And so with that, if you have questions for me, go ahead and put them in the queue at any time. I'll be able to see the list. I'll glance over there from time to time to see if there's any I can answer during the presentation, but for the most part, I'll answer them at the very end. So feel free to ask questions throughout. And finally, we are recording this webinar, so we'll share it with you later on today or tomorrow, depending on how quickly I get everything sent out. But feel free to share this with somebody else at your church, or just use it to review aspects that you wanted to learn in a little bit greater detail. All right, so if you are not familiar with Concordia Technology Solutions, we are the church administration division of Concordia Publishing House, and we've been producing software for churches since 1984, which is kind of mind-boggling when you think about what technology was like at that time. But we have churches who have been using our software since the DOS days, and they have continually upgraded. And now what you're seeing today is the latest iteration of our church software, which is Church360. We'll be looking at Church360 Ledger, but it is just one component in the Church360 suite. That includes Church360 Members, which is our people management software. It also allows you to manage attendance and offerings. And then we have Church360 Unite, which is all about your church website and communications, digital communications, which are so important in this day of age. And all three of these work nicely together. So there's not a lot of connection between Unite and Ledger because those don't typically overlap. But between Members and Ledger, your offerings sync, and so those automatically can create a pending transaction for you. So we'll take a look at that shortly. But again, our focus today is on Church360 Ledger. It is church finance software. It is designed to be intuitive and secure, but more specifically, especially for those of you who are here today, it is designed to be focused on churches. And that is kind of a rarity in today's day and age, where you have finance software that is not designed for businesses. We hear that quite a bit, that people are using tools like QuickBooks, which is a fantastic tool for a business, but it comes with a lot of things that churches don't need. And so that's why we have Church360 Ledger as kind of a lightweight church finance software that does just the things a church needs and nothing more. So that's what we're going to look at today. And that's really a key thing for volunteers, is that when you focus on the basics, the things that have to get done, and you have a really strong understanding of those basics, you're better equipped to manage your church's finances. All right, Before we go into the presentation, I want to talk a little bit about you. I always have a few assumptions that I make about those who attend my webinars. I am assuming that you are familiar with church finances. Again, this webinar is about helping a volunteer take them on. If you are the volunteer who is learning how to take them on, there will be valuable information, but there may be a few things that I go through too quickly or don't explain in as great of detail as might be necessary for somebody who's brand new to finances. I don't expect you to be an expert. That's why I say familiar with them, because often we don't have those experts serving in the volunteer role at our churches. I'm assuming that you're new to Church360 Ledger. Again, this is an overview. This is not meant to be a detailed training course on how to use Church360 Ledger, but rather to show somebody else the core components of church finances. And I'm also assuming you're extremely busy. I think that's probably my safest assumption of the bunch, because I've yet to meet anybody who works in the church, whether they are a paid staff person or a volunteer, who is not extremely busy. And I think that's just kind of the nature of serving in the church, is that there are always more people to reach with the gospel. And we do this in so many different ways, including managing the finances to help equip others as they share the gospel. So there's a lot that goes into church work. It's all focused on pointing people to Christ. And so that's a very busy task. It's a never-ending task until the Lord returns. All right, so let me ask you to tell me a little bit about yourself. I'm going to share a poll, and with this question of what role do you play in the church, or what role do you have as your primary role? And we know that many people will have multiple roles that they have. I'm just looking for your primary role. So if you can click the button that best describes your primary role, that would be very helpful to me. And it looks like we've got the majority are in that financial manager role. And that's kind of what I expected. So very good. Thank you very much for answering that. And then my next question, just to help me see where you're at with software, is are you currently using Church360 Ledger? Because I know oftentimes people use these webinars to kind of see whether or not they'd like to purchase the software. And I don't want to make this a sales pitch, but I do want to make it helpful for you. And so the better understanding I have, it helps with as I shape the presentation. All right, looks like we got a fairly even mix between yes, no, and no, but planning too soon. So thank you very much. I appreciate that. All right, I will close that. All right, let's move forward. Thanks for answering those questions. Let's talk about what we're going to talk about today. The outline for today will be a quick overview of Church360 Ledger. And this is just explaining kind of what went into it. And it's really a good narrative about the state of finances in the church. So that'll be just a couple minutes. Then we'll tour through the software, hitting all of these high notes. And I'll show those in an outline in just a moment, but it's things like the chart of accounts and transactions. We'll finally wrap up with Q&As at the end, like I mentioned before. So what are the thoughts behind Church360 Ledger? As we've developed the software, what is it that we knew about churches that we put into this software? Well, first off, we know that church finances are often managed by volunteers, and that's exactly the subject for today. How do you help a volunteer get moving forward with taking over the church finances? We also know that most volunteers are not accountants, and that's exactly what we're going through in my church today, is that we had a person serving in a treasurer type role for years and years who was an accountant. But now that he has taken a step back, we are left with lay people who are in different roles, like software marketing managers such as myself, who have a basic understanding of finance, but are certainly not accountants and are not trained in all of the intricacies of finances. So because of that, accountability is even more important in the church than anywhere else. You have people who are very eager to help, but you don't want them to make mistakes, to misuse the church's funds. All of the funds are coming from the offering plates, or if you have a school, from tuition. So they're very much tied to specific purposes, and so that accountability is so important. So accountability is about preventing the ill intention from doing wrong. And we hear about that on the news, where somebody, either a paid person or a volunteer, is taking money from the church. That's part of accountability. But another big part of accountability is just preventing the well-intentioned from making mistakes. And that, I think, happens far more often than the other one, where there's somebody who is trying to do right, but makes a mistake and it affects the church finances. And so we can't prevent either of these things from happening 100%, but we can sure try to do as much as we can from a software perspective. And you, as the person who is training a volunteer to take over, has that in the back of your mind throughout this whole time, especially if you've been the one who has been doing this for the church. You understand that you want a good, honest person who is going to treat these finances correctly because they are gifts to the Lord. But you also want somebody who's going to treat them accurately and not make mistakes and not make a mess of things. So I think you can probably relate very well to both of these thoughts. So we designed Church360 Ledger to increase the accountability and to prevent mistakes. So these are the things that we're going to cover. First off, we're going to look at the chart of accounts, and we're going to talk about the different kinds of accounts that go into a church. And then we're going to show how you do that in Church360 Ledger. We've tried to make it as straightforward as possible so that people can't accidentally create an expense account when they meant to create a liability or something like that. Then we're going to go through the budgeting process. And this is the time where it opens up for even more volunteers, because generally that is a group event, and it's not a very exciting group event like some of the other things that we do at a church, but it's a necessary one. And it's finding out the information from the ministry leaders, from those who are closest to the information, and compiling it in one spot. So we'll look at budgeting, then we'll go through the process of entering transactions. Now, depending on how your church is set up, it may not be the volunteer who is entering transactions. In our congregation, the first two parts of that are led by the treasurer or the board of finance, but the transactions are done by a financial coordinator who's a paid staff person who doesn't make decisions. She just takes care of the day-to-day transactions. And that's a really good setup, although when it's multiple people, that could cause some confusion. So we'll go through that, how to do that within Church360 Ledger, and then reconciliation, which is of course an important part of the day-to-day, but also an important part of auditing. If it hasn't been done, doing that is a key part of auditing. So we'll look at how to do that in Church360 Ledger. And then finally, we'll look at reports. And we have a variety of ways of looking at the information within the software, but the reports are the standard financial reports that need to show the information that you typically show on a quarterly or annual basis, sometimes even monthly. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to switch gears, switch my screen over to Church360 Ledger, and I've already started a free account here. So we offer a free 37-day trial that gives you 30 days plus the 7 at the end to do the reconciliation. And I encourage you, if you haven't already done that, to go ahead and start one. You can follow along here. What I have done is set up a brand new start from scratch account, because I think that's really important as we begin to look at this, that we understand the components, that we can teach the components without all of the data, without all of the transactions and the additional information that could distract from really the principles of church finances. So this is our main screen. We have the top navigation bar that lets you switch between books, which we'll look at in a moment, the check printing, the reports, the settings, and the user settings. Then we have this, what we call the Omni bar, which allows you to access any account just by going and finding it. Now, we don't have any accounts right now because we started from scratch, so that's going to be one of the first things we do. And then from any screen, you can enter a new transaction. We're going to spend quite a bit of time in there. Finally, we have down here the ability to drill in deeper to these transactions and see all the line items. So let's go ahead and take a look over here under settings and just see how we're set up. First off, I want to talk about books. Books are a set of a chart of accounts. It's a set of transactions. You can have multiple books at a church. I know at my church, we have one set of books for the church and the school. But I know in some schools where there is an association, the school books are kept separately from the church books. And I know even now in my congregation, we have different groups like the men's club or the ladies guild that have their own set of books. So those aren't often managed by the church staff, but you could have them all in the same place. And then you can take advantage of some of the same things like payees and vendor information and still keep them separate. So right now we have just one set of books, but if we wanted to add a new set of books for like the school and have that be on a different fiscal year, maybe July, we could say, all right, starting, oops, we'll go to July 2018. We could do that. And that is often a reason to have different sets of books if you have different and appropriate fiscal years. So now when I go up here, I can switch between church and school. So that's the first thing to memorize or to remember, is that your set of books is based for a specific purpose, specific accounts, and it doesn't overlap with any of the transactions. Now we're going to go in under fiscal years and show how that works. This is a quick thing. Once you set a fiscal year, it's rather rare that you would switch it, but it does happen. And sometimes if you have multiple sets of books, you're switching it to align them. Well, you can change the start of a fiscal year here to be either calendar or non-calendar fiscal year. And what it will do in Church360 Ledger is create a shortened fiscal year. And that's an approach that should not be taken lightly because you might have a 6-month fiscal year, and that has tax implications and things that are a little bit beyond what we're covering today, but the functionality is available. All right, I just want to touch on those because those are kind of overarching and won't really impact more of what we do today, but this certainly will. The chart of accounts. Now, everything around the transactions ties back to the chart of accounts, not just what accounts you're putting the transactions to, but how the transactions function. And this is where it starts to get a little dicey, and I'm going to do a quick review of some finances, understanding that I am not a church finance expert, but it's this base knowledge that any volunteer needs to know before they become involved with the finances. So what I'm going to do is go back to my PowerPoint and talk about the different types of accounts. Now, there are 4 types that we have here, and depending on your software, you might have some others. In our Shepherd Staff software, we have what's called dedicated accounts. We'll talk about how we address that in Church360 Ledger. But within our Church360 Ledger, you have assets, which these are probably the easiest to understand. These are cash assets, places where the money is physically located, or at least you can physically get money from these locations. So we're talking things like checking accounts or savings accounts, things, accounts where you pay out of them or deposit into. So if we're tying this to personal finances, it's very likely that you might have your own checking account and a savings account. You might even have them at the same bank, or you might have multiple savings accounts across different banks and your checking is associated with one of those banks. We'll show you how to set that up at a very basic level. The next thing is liabilities. This is real money that you owe to someone. So in the context of the church, it might be a mortgage for a building project, maybe the mortgage for your entire church building. It could be something like a credit card. Sometimes it's safer to authorize the pastor to use a credit card with a specific limit, and then that is kept as a liability and paid off each month. Now, I don't recommend giving pastor a very high credit card because most pastors don't need to spend much money, but it's a good way to help control those finances, make it easily accessible for the pastor to spend what he needs or any other ministry leader without giving direct access to the checking account. I think about youth groups as a way of doing that too. Heaven forbid that the youth group credit card gets lost on a mission trip, but it's much better than the checkbook or the debit card get lost when you're maybe in a foreign country. So there's various reasons why you might use a liability. This is also kind of a staging ground, if you will, for things like payroll transactions. So if you are withholding certain amounts from the paycheck to pay for taxes or other expenses, those would go into liabilities until they're paid out. Next up, we have income, and this is where we kind of create a shift. And this is how I like to explain this to people who are brand new to finances, is that income is saying exactly for what purpose the money coming in is. It's not the money itself that goes into an asset, but it's for what purpose the money or the offerings are for. And in the same way, expenses is not real money going out. That is still with assets or liabilities, but it's for what purpose is it going out. And as we talk about budgeting, Budgeting affects these last two, income and expense. And so as we go into the budget screen, those are the only two things that you budget. And for me, that really made a lot of sense. And as I lead our church council, that's what I talk about, is that you are budgeting based on purposes. Certainly there's actual dollars there, but you're not saying, okay, well, we're going to get $100 from Sally and we're going to get $50 from Bill. That might be done through pledges, but that is a separate part of it. That is not finances, that's more stewardship. And that's part of managing the gifts that God has given us. But income and expense is truly saying, for what purpose are these actual dollars being used, not where are the actual dollars. All right, so I hope that makes sense. So we'll set up a few of these right now, and I think that'll help clear it up a little bit if there is any confusion. So we're back to the chart of accounts, and here are those 4 account types. Under assets, we're going to start there, and we've got 2 options, new accounts or new categories. I like to think of the categories as just a folder structure. It's a way for you to summarize accounts at subtotals or totals, if that's where you roll it up into, without actually processing transactions against those categories. So let me show you what I mean. We might have one, and our fictional church is Christ Lutheran Church in Bakersville. So we might have the Bakersville National Bank. That is a category, and right now there's no money towards it, and we can't actually have any transactions go towards it because it's the bank, it's not the account. Then you see over here, you can tell that there's a dark line. That gives you kind of a clue. This is just a category. Now we're going to create another category, and we're going to call this savings. And then we'll create another category, and we'll call this checking. Now, we could do this in a couple different ways. If you have multiple savings account, then what I would say is put Bakersville National Bank underneath savings. You see that kind of indentation there? Or if you have these 2 accounts, both under Bakersville, you can do that. Now, that's a strategy to get in place first before you set up your chart of accounts. But let's say you have multiple savings accounts in the same bank or multiple checking accounts. This is a good way to do that. So there's different strategies involved, but I think for our purposes today, we are just going to keep that process and make it really simple. So I'm going to delete these categories and just create those accounts. So I'm going to say savings, and I can enter my account number. The account number doesn't matter for the system. We tried to keep that very simple. There's an internal ID that doesn't show up, but this could be a reference to your actual bank account number. So I'm going to put in a few numbers there, and I'm going to do an initial balance of 0. And I'm going to say you cannot write checks from this account. And hit submit, and drag and drop that under Bakersville National Bank. Then I'm going to add another account and call this checking. And I'll add another few random numbers here and do a 0 initial balance there. But I will say we can write checks from our checking account. That kind of makes sense. All right, there we go. And I'll drag this underneath Bakersville National Bank as well. Now I can't actually drag an account underneath in another account, but I can stack my categories as deep as I want it to go. Now you get too deep and you have 4 or 5 different categories, it starts to become confusing. But I recommend 2, maybe 3, 4 at the most before it starts getting too confusing. It just depends on how you want to structure your chart of accounts. Now I'm going to click Save, and this will tell me exactly what I've done. It says I've rearranged accounts or categories. I've created 1 new category, 2 new accounts. I'm going to confirm that. These changes don't lock in until you save that. And so if you are doing kind of a trial and error thing to see how you want your chart of accounts to set up, you have that luxury. Let's move into liabilities next. I'm going to keep this really simple, and I'm going to say a new category. And this is also going to be Bakersville National Bank, because this is through whom we have our credit card. And then I'm going to add another new account here, and I'm going to say Pastor's credit card. And when I said another new account, I should just say add a new liability account. So Pastor's credit card, and we'll add some number in there with a 0 initial balance. And then we could just add another one that's just the church credit card. Again, random number, and oops, I clicked out of it. Let me do that one more time. Church credit card, random number with 0 balance. I'll put both of these under Bakersville National Bank because that's the service that we're using for our credit card, and we've got 2 different credit cards through there. So I can go ahead and hit save there. Okay, confirm that. Now let's go into income. And again, we're keeping this very simple because it's more important to get the concepts down than to flesh out an entire chart of accounts in this training session. So we're going to go into income, and there's usually 2 types of income. There's the income that is given for a charitable purpose and the income that's given for a service, goods or service, such as school tuition. Now we're going to say in this case, our school has a separate chart of accounts, but there is still other ways that churches will receive income for a goods or service, such as facility rentals. So let's go with that approach. So I'm going to do a new category and just first off say offerings. And then I'm going to do another category and say, let's see, fees, and we'll just call it fees. There we go. So the first account under new account, I'm going to call the general fund. How many churches have a general fund? I'm guessing most of them. And we're not going to put an account number here because it doesn't reference an actual bank account or anything. But if you have an accounting numbering system you want to continue using, you could use that. We'll do that with a 0 balance and move that under offerings. Now let's do a couple, oops, let's do another category let's do a category and call this ministries. And we'll say youth group with a 0 initial balance. And we'll do another one for VBS. So people often donate to youth group or VBS. And so we're going to move that, oops, wrong one. Move that under ministries and move ministries under offerings. So I did this to show this kind of tree structure that we have, because if we want to summarize all the ministries apart from the general fund, we can do that through categories. And now let's look at fees. So if we do a new account for fees and call this facility rentals, do a 0 balance, and then let's do another one of, let's see, new account, we'll call this VBS registration. I don't like when churches charge for VBS, but I understand it's absolutely necessary in many cases. It's hard to donate that much in addition to the general fund. And so oftentimes churches will charge $5 or $10 or sometimes more for VBS registration. And that is for a service. So that is not a charitable donation since it's a requirement. So this is our very basic income structure. If you have a school, you might want to split up into the different types of fees. You might have tuition and sports and books, and if you break it down in that way and you want to see that, well, we can expect to receive this much for books this year, you could do that. But this is a very basic structure. So I'm going to go ahead and save that, confirm. And now let's get into our expenses. And often they'll kind of mirror the income, not identically. But one of the first things that you'll have will be payroll. We certainly want to pay our pastors and our other church workers. So a payroll category. We'll do another category called ministries. If I could type, that'd be helpful. There we go. And let's just call this next one general expenses. You could also have something like utilities. All right, now let's create a new account, and we're just going to call this pastor's salary. And we'll move that under payroll. Now let's do the same kind of thing. What's the youth ministry, or youth group, we'll call it. And that'll go under ministries. And then we'll have another one for VBS. And we'll move that under here. And then under general expenses, well, office supplies. It's usually a good one to have in there. And under utilities, let's put something like electricity. Also a good thing to pay for on a regular basis. All right, so again, very simple, very straightforward, but hopefully it helps explain which each of these are, because I think as you look at this, you may not confuse, it might be very difficult to confuse these. Now, in cases like VBS or the youth group, you might have an income and an expense account for them, but that's where it becomes very clear. Well, this is money for the youth group, and this is money from the youth group, money that the youth group is spending. So let's go ahead and save that. All right, so let's talk about another strategy for how you might accept funds for specific purposes. Now that we've got our chart of accounts basically set up for a very general small church, I want to talk about how you manage gifts that are given for a specific purpose. In our congregation, we have a building fund, and that could be for capital improvements or new expansion in the future. A lot of gifts go to that, especially memorials. So what we do is under a general fund, we would say, let's see here. Sorry, I'm already getting myself confused. It's under assets, because again, we are setting aside this money for a specific purpose. It's going to come in through an income, but we want it to be set aside physically to not be used. So we'll put this here under savings and say a new restricted fund, meaning that is restricted for this purpose. So I'm going to do new restricted fund and call this building fund, and hit submit. So in our savings account, we're going to have a certain amount of dollars, and a portion of those dollars will be set aside for the building fund, and the rest of it will be unrestricted, meaning it can be used for general purposes. And you could do your checking in the same way. You could say new restricted fund, which is for the youth group. That money is designated for youth group purposes. It doesn't mean it's owned by the youth group. It just means that it's meant for youth group purposes. And so you don't want to accidentally spend money that was given for the youth group on something like utilities. So we now can have unrestricted in savings and unrestricted in checking. So I'll save that. And now let's start, confirm that. Now let's start planning out the budget. Now, we can go into budget for a long time. There's a lot of different ways to use the budget screen. I'm going to try to keep this as basic as possible. Again, we're helping a volunteer get started. We just want to get the basics down, and then we can talk about efficiencies and other things. So under settings, you can go to budgets, and this is going to give you the income and expense like we talked about before. So not nearly all the accounts that we have set up, because income and expense are the things that we can estimate that is coming through. It's expected income, it's expected expense. It's not actual yet. So we can go in and change it in a number of ways. If you have data in the system, you can change it to the same as last year's budget or last year's actuals and have that be your starting point. You can also go account by account and say, all right, every month I expect to get $5,000 in my general fund. Well, you could go and do that 12 times, or you could just go over here to general fund, click 60,000 and get 5,000 each time. And you say, okay, well, Easter is in April. We usually get about 15,000 that month. And over in Christmas in December, we usually get 25,000. Well, that puts us up to 90,000. Well, during July and August, that's more like 3,000. So you can start breaking these down and do it by month or by total and have an even split. Now, let's say we usually get a big donation from a specific member that we know of. An anonymous member donates 2,000 for VBS every May. We could just plug that in there, and now May's income has been updated to that total. You see, it's different than the offerings, the general fund, because the ministries add up to that. It's the same as offerings because it's general fund offerings and VBS offerings. But then we could also say, okay, well, on average during the year, we get about 2,000 for facility rentals. I'm not sure when that's going to come in. We don't know exactly why, so we'll just budget it out and see where we're at. And that gets changed it changes your income as well up at the top. So I hope that makes sense. We're going to do these next ones as kind of a high level. So 50,000 for pastor. Again, it's a small church. Youth group gets 5,000 every year. VBS, we're going to expect it to cost about 2,000. That'll equal out the income and expense. Office supplies, maybe $300 during the year, and electricity, $500. These are just numbers I'm throwing out there, but I wanted to really get a good sampling of how you can see all of the different budget numbers. And then you can use this as kind of a trial balance for your budget. Export this out to Excel, share it with your ministry leaders, get their feedback, and go from there. You can also take it from Excel and paste it back in, and it'll fit the same order. Those are some more advanced tools that we aren't going to get into today. But the core concept is understanding how you go about budgeting and knowing that it's not a guarantee, knowing that you use the best information you have and create the best possible thing, knowing that the budget will not accurately reflect reality down to every penny. Maybe not down to every $100 or $1,000. Things change, but you do your best to get it as close as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. Now I want to talk about transactions. So I'm going to the home screen. I mentioned before that you can do a transaction from any screen anytime, but you'd go up here to new transactions. And I want to start with the most difficult, journal entry. We're going to start talking about this, then I'll show you transaction paths, and we'll come back to journal entry. Basically, every transaction is a journal entry. That's all it is. If you have that in mind, that's going to be both very simple and confusing. But it'll make the other transactions make more sense. And this is what's called T-chart accounting. And I'm not an expert. Again, I'm not a financial expert by any means, but this is core concepts in accounting and church finances. You have your 4 account types, and you have transaction types, which are debits and credits, meaning they increase or decrease your accounts. Now, I'm sure if you've been managing church finances, this is very familiar to you. But I can tell you that I still struggle to remember which is which. If I have, an income, a gift given from the offering plate, I need to look back at this chart and say, okay, well, I need to credit my income and debit my asset because I need to increase both of those. If I am paying for something out of our checking account, I need to credit our asset and debit our expense. I have, in fact, on my bulletin board over here, this exact chart because it's a very clear picture for me of what I need to do. Now, once you get into the habit of doing this, it sticks with you. I know people who can rattle this off the top of their head, and it's not too bad. There's not too many variables, but I think that's why I struggle with it, because they're so similar. But what we do in Church360 and Ledger is a little bit different. It still follows those same principles. If I wanted to do, increase, let's do our memo first, and we'll say offering for general fund. And we're going to do this on last Sunday. I can put a payee in there. I don't have to. In some cases, when you're paying a bill, it's very important to put that in there. But we'll say, okay, this is going into unrestricted checking, and it's coming from the general fund. So again, going back to my chart, I want to debit my asset and credit my income account. So this is my asset, and I can say 500 there and 500 there. So 500 is being debited to my checking account in unrestricted, and 500 is being credited to my income account. These have to balance, and that's really the number one rule of any transactions, is your debits and credits have to match. And when they match, you'll get this nice green color here, and we can go ahead and save that. So you can see now, all of a sudden, I start to have balances in my account. My assets are worth $500. I have $500 of income. That's how you fill up these accounts. It's all very logical, but for somebody who's brand new, getting to this step can take a little while. And so I like to simplify it as much as I can down to exactly what's happening so that they can build up their knowledge. But we do know that that is complicated, and it's easier to understand that if somebody gives you a helping hand. So let's look at these different transaction types. Let's first off look at a deposit. So that is exactly what we just did. We got offerings and we put them into our checking account. So we'll say offerings. We'll do this the week before, so October 7th. And we're going to say, now you see here, I've got multiple accounts up here, and my T chart is down below with debits and credits. So it asks you, well, what asset are you putting this in? Well, I'm putting this in our unrestricted checking, and I'm going to put in $1,000. Well, that came from a combination of the general fund, which was 800, and the youth group, which was 200. And it'll try to make it balance. So you notice that when I put in 800, it automatically put in 200. It wants to have a balanced transaction. And if I change this to 100, I get this open line and say, well, you got 100 still left. Until you can balance it, we can't move forward. So, all right, we'll put that under VBS. So that may, hopefully that's what it was designated for. We're not just picking accounts to put them in there. But this gives us a balanced transaction. It's a little bit easier to understand than having to pick the debits and credits. And now you can see down here, my T chart balances. It has the debits and credits, so I can validate that it's doing it right. But really all I had to think about was that top part. So now I can go ahead and save that. Well, what if you say, actually, it was $200 that was supposed to go to the youth group. We need to move $100 from unrestricted to the youth group. Well, that's pretty simple. That is a transfer. And that's the first one up here. You're going to do a new transaction for a transfer. And we're going to say move youth group gift from unrestricted. Oops, well, we'll just say, I forgot there's a character limit on there. Move youth group gift. And we're going to say, well, this is in the unrestricted unrestricted checking account. And that's $100. And because it's a transfer, it's got to go into a different asset. That's what that transfer does, is it says, well, you're locking these down. You're moving from one account type to the same account type, just a different account. So now we say to the youth group, and it automatically puts in that $100, so I have it balanced, and it gives me this, which essentially is a journal entry, but we're calling it a transfer. So we'll go ahead and save that. And now that shifts over there. Let's talk about another one, expense, a payment. So I'm going to go in here and click payment, and it's going to start off by saying, do you want to charge this to an asset or a liability? Well, typically it's assets, but remember we put credit cards under liabilities. So let me show you both real quick. Let's say that the first one is the electricity bill. And we're going to call this American Electricity. Did I spell that? Yep. Is our payee. And then I will go to unrestricted checking, and we're going to say this was $75, and that's the electricity. So I am paying a $75 bill, and I'm taking it out of my checking account. Maybe this is an online payment, maybe using our church debit card. Maybe, well, it's not a check, that's a separate thing. I'll show that in a moment. But unrestricted checking to electricity, and my credits and debits are correct. Sorry, not to electricity, for electricity. See, it's easy to get these things confused, but I'm going to go ahead and click save. So now my expenses have increased because I paid a bill. Well, let's say a pastor wanted to buy the latest Concordia commentary from our publishing house, CPH, but he's going to put that on his pastor credit card. So we're going to go to new transaction, which is a payment, and we're going to say new Concordia commentary. And the payee is Concordia Publishing House. And we're going to do it from pastor's credit card. And I believe with the pastoral discount, it's $40. I could be wrong. It might be $42. Let's do $42. Now, we don't actually have an expense account for pastor. We probably should have. So we'll just put this under office supplies. But you can see this is a liability. But when it's asset or liability, we know that the liability can handle a transaction. We're paying from the credit card, which means we're going to owe the credit card company. So we'll go ahead and hit save there. And now my liabilities have increased. Well, let's go ahead and pay off this credit card, but we're going to pay it with a check. So I have another transaction type that's a check, which is essentially a payment with a few extra things. So we're going to put this memo as pay credit card bill. And the payee is going to be Bakersville National Bank. And the asset or liability, well, we're paying it from our checking account. It has to be an account that writes checks anyways. So you see under checking account, now we could do a liability there as well if we wanted to have that as a checking account, but we're going to do unrestricted checking, and we're going to say $42, and we're going to do it on pastor's credit card. Now there is a little bit of a difference here because of when we put that in. That little arrow is to flag if there's not enough money in there, but I think because the way our dates fell, doing it on the exact same day, that's why it's showing that there. It's just something to pay attention to. But you can see here that we have a bank account, unrestricted checking, paid to the order of Bakersville National Bank. So it kind of mocks up the check that we're going to have. But the important thing is the credits and debits are correct. And now I go ahead and hit save. And now it says the check was added to your print queue. My print queue is up here, which says you have a check waiting to be printed. Now, I could go into my already pre-printed checkbook, write this by hand, and click check and mark this as printed. Or I can purchase checks through our Forms Plus ink partner and print them through my regular printer on our official checks that have our name and everything. And so if I do that, I go over here to print, and it'll show me what it looks like. It's a top check. We can always switch that to a middle as well and click print. So this allows me to then put in that check number, print it out from my printer, and moving forward. But the important thing that I want to show here, and we'll just mark this as printed now. Yep, confirm, remove that from the queue. The important thing is we're building up our list of transactions. We've paid the credit card bill. Now our liabilities is down to 0 because it started out high with that $42 and we paid it off. Now you can see the running balance is 0. Our asset accounts here, we have Bakersville National Bank, where we actually don't have any in savings right now. It's all under checking. And it's mostly under unrestricted, although the youth group has $100. Oh, that's right, because we deposited in there. I thought we did transfer some. I'm wondering if I may put the wrong date in there. Yeah, that's the money that we transferred. So this is what's nice about this, is that you can go in here and see, okay, here's my deposit. Oops, let's click on that. Now I can see where I'm at. So unrestricted from VBS to, oh, that was in the income, but it all went under the unrestricted. See, this is what I like about this, because it's so easy to make these mistakes and think, okay, well, yeah, we got that from the youth group. Well, what we should have done is put this youth group $100 into the youth group checking. So while I'm here, let's go ahead and change that. Let's say youth group should have been under checking, and this is 900, and this is 100. There we go. And I'll go ahead and hit save. And now that's fixed. And all the accountants in the room are like, wait, what? No, you can't edit a transaction. You need to do a journal entry for that. You can't just change something in the past. That is how people can con the system, how they can embezzle money and hide their tracks. Well, we've taken that into account. What we have done here is, even though we edited a transaction, and it's really that easy to edit the transaction, we didn't actually edit the transaction. If you look over here where this now, because again, we're in unrestricted, where this transaction has $900 instead of $1,000, it gives you this clue that this transaction has been edited. There's a little drop down there, and when I click on it, it shows exactly what happened. Edited on 10/18/18, $100. If I click on that transaction again, it'll take me in here and it'll say prior amendments on the offerings. And you can always put an amendment memo too. I didn't do that. But it gives you this idea, and see, when you look at it there, the updated transaction is correct, but there's proof that it's changed. And in fact, it might be hard to find these, except that we have up here our event log. So under reports, under event log, it says I created a new transaction. This transaction here, a revision of the old transaction. And when I click on this new transaction, it shows me that $100 journal entry. So we kind of accomplished both purposes there. We prevented a mistake, or helped fix a mistake in this case, but we also have kept a full audit trail of that so that everybody knows exactly what happened. You can see what changes were made. All right, I am right at 50 minutes. I have gone over my mark already, and I still have 2 more things I want to show. So I don't have many questions in the queue. In fact, it doesn't look like I have any in there. Yeah. So feel free to ask questions. I'm going to keep going with these last 2 things. These are what I showed you was what was most important, but I want to show you reconciliation, and I want to show you reports, and those are both fairly brief. So let me go back up here. And you can only reconcile the asset accounts. And that's the main thing. As you are reconciling your bank accounts, that's what you're doing, is you're checking to say, is what the bank says I have exactly what I have? So go to assets. I should say, clarify that. Is what my ledger says I have exactly what I have according to the bank? Because really the bank is the ultimate source. So if I go into my Bakersville National Bank checking account, you have to get to the account level. Now you can see this green reconcile button. These are all the transactions I've had that have affected the checking account. And when I go into reconcile, I look here and I can start checking these off and say, okay, well, my bank statement says my starting balance was 0, but my ending balance is 1,425. That's what my bank statement says. So I'll go line by line and say, all right, well, the first one was a $900 deposit. Then there was a $100 deposit. I've got a $500 deposit, it looks like. Another $100 deposit. And then looks like a withdrawal of 100 and another withdrawal of 75. As I check those off, you can see my off buy right over here changes. And once my off buy is 0, then I know it's balanced. And so you go one by one with each transaction and check it off. And when it's off by 0, then you can save that. And when you save this reconciliation, what that is doing is locking those transactions. Now I can't make any changes because I've already confirmed that they have occurred. So that is how the reconciliation process works. It's that simple. Now I know reconciliation, when you have several dozen lines, is not that simple, but the concept, regardless of the size, is the same, and that is simple. All right, last up, let's go take a look at our reports. So up here under reports, you'll see here that we've got the 4 main ones. You have your general ledger, income and expense, chart of accounts, and balance sheet. And we put event logs there at the bottom because it's like a report. It's not a financial report, but it's a report of activities. So we'll go to general ledger first. This is your ledger across all account types. And this allows you to look at them different than your account view. You can look at it just by your checks and say, okay, here's my check ledger. Or maybe you can say my journal entries. These are all the ones that had a journal entry type. Or you could say, well, maybe let's just look at it by Pastor's credit card and see how that came across and see both sides of the transaction. Whereas if I go straight to Pastor's credit card, I am seeing both sides of it. I guess I shouldn't say it in that way, but to see all the different types of transactions in there. You can also group it and say, well, let's group it by payee. So these had no payees. Here's the American Electricity, Bakersville National Bank, Concordia Publishing House. Let's go to the income and expense. Income and expense is where your budget comes into play. And you say, okay, for the year, let's say for October, Well, October, our budget was $5,166. That's our budget for income. Well, we've only had 1,500 come in. Our budget for expenses were 4,800. We've only spent 117. We haven't had our payroll hit this month yet, or this pay period. But you can see those differences. So you can see what the difference between the budget and the actual is, and then what percentage. So it gives you some of those budget information. And you can do this for any date range that you want. You can do it by quarters, by month, or by any custom date range. Your chart of accounts is similar to that in that it lists all of your accounts here, assets, liabilities, income, and expense, and shows starting and ending balances as opposed to budget and actuals. It also shows the changes, the debits and the credits, and the total amount of the change. Whereas your balance sheet only shows your assets and liabilities and basically shows you where you're at as a net. How much do we have? How much do we owe? What's the net? And again, it shows your debits and credits. So the basic financial reports that you need are all right there and easily accessible, and you just change the date range to the one that makes the most sense for you. All right, I flew through that, I feel. Let me go to my final slides, and if you have any questions, please go ahead and put those in. I really hope that that large amount of information could be understood. I know I go quickly sometimes, but if you haven't already, I encourage you to start a free 37-day trial at 360ledger.com. That will allow you to have more than a full month of transactions and enough time to reconcile according to your bank statement. If you would like to get started with Church360 Ledger, I know several of you have not already, you can contact our sales team, our software consultants who help kind of work with you, figure out if it's the right fit for your church. Their information is on the left side of the screen. If you're already a customer and just need some help to get started or learn some more about this, you can contact our software support technicians. Their information is on the right side of the screen. The technicians are there not just for problems. Sometimes when you hear software support, you think, oh, well, I haven't had any problems with it. I'm just looking to learn more. They're there for everything. Any help that you need. If you are the new volunteer, and you're like, well, where do I get started? They can walk you through that process. They can point you to training resources. If you just want to learn about a specific feature or ask a question, they can help you with that. Now, one thing to caution you on, they are not financial experts. They will not advise you on how to set up your chart of accounts, what accounts to use, but they'll advise you on how to set up your chart of accounts in Church360 Ledger, how to use the functionality of the software. So there's a little bit of a difference there, but they can explain that to you too. If you don't know who to ask, call our support text. They'll be happy to help you out. All right, we are just about out of time, and I actually don't have any questions in the queue, which means I covered everything entirely, I'm sure. I know that's never the case, but I hope you found this information valuable, and if you'd like to learn more about it, either from is this right for my church or how do I use this, please use the contact information on the screen. But I'm going to go ahead and wrap up now, and thank you very much for joining me. I really appreciate your time, taking it out of your busy day to learn more about how to train a volunteer to take on your church finances. Thanks again. Have a great day.